And I think I'll hand that back to you, Angus.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Zoom machine. So we're here for this meeting to talk about a very interesting book. It is My Travels in Dingyi by Tiesheng. I think I'll try and introduce in this order. I'll introduce the book, the author, our special guest, and then myself. Maybe that's not the most logical order, but it puts me last, which is polite, at least. So My Travels in Dingyi, what is it about? It is an epic novel told from the perspective of a nomadic spirit. What exactly a nomadic spirit is, I think we may get into. The nomadic spirit is named Shi. Pay attention to that name, Shi, who inhabits a Chinese boy living in the second half of the 20th century. And think about what's happening in China at that time. Shi describes coming of age during the Cultural Revolution in language that dips and soars from crude to lyrical, often in a single breath. And I've read the book. That's true. It's true in translation anyway. I'm sure it's the same in Chinese. Sarah might tell us a bit about that. Unpredictable and engrossing, this contemporary classic of Chinese fiction was first published in 2006 and is now available in English for the first time. Like I said, I've read the book. It's certainly unpredictable. It's certainly engrossing, and we'll be hopefully getting into why precisely it's a classic. So who's our author? He is Shi Tiesheng. He was born in the 50s and as of 2010 is no longer with us. He was one of the most prominent Chinese writers of the second half of the 20th century. Oh yes, born 1951 precisely. He attended Tsinghua University High School before being sent down to Yan'an in Shanxi province as part of the Cultural Revolution campaign to re-educate urban youth in the countryside. But in 1971, he sustained an injury to his spine that paralyzed him from the waist down. I'm sure we might be talking a bit about that as well. On returning to Beijing, he wrote as a way to process his grief and explore the world. And you'll definitely, if you read My Travels in Dingyi, you'll see the exploration across many different dimensions of life. His first work of fiction was published in 1979, and he went on to write a number of acclaimed books, including Notes on Principles and several short story and essay collections. Shi's 1985 novella, Like a Banjo String, was turned into a film by the acclaimed director Chen Kaige. In January 2018, the complete works of Shi Tiesheng was published by Beijing Publishing House, comprising 12 volumes of his novels, short stories, essays, scripts, poetry, letters, and interview transcripts. His essay, The Temple of Earth and I, is considered a masterpiece and is taught throughout schools in China. Okay, that is the novel. So who have we brought in to talk about that novel? We've brought in Professor Sarah Dauncey. And I should say, we were also going to have Professor Chloe Starr. She's in the Zoom room, but she's not really feeling, she's sustained a bit of an injury, I think, and is still enduring some of the lingering after effects of a concussion. So hello, Chloe. Glad you're here with us in spirit, appropriate for this novel, perhaps. And hello to Sarah. So Sarah, I do have a sort of blurb describing your career, but would you like to introduce yourself instead?
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Angus. And also hello to Chloe, and sorry that you can't be with us present, because I was hoping we'd very much have a nice sort of conversation between the two of us about Shi Tiesheng and this particular book. But anyway, I'm glad she's here, and she's very kindly also sort of sent me some of her thoughts, so hopefully I'll try and weave those in. Well, as for me, I'm a professor of Chinese Society and Disability at the University of Nottingham. Prior to that, I started off my career in Chinese studies. So I suppose my speciality from the start was really Chinese literature, Chinese culture, Chinese language. And I spent a lot of time delving in and out of the Ming Dynasty and Ming Dynasty fiction in particular, the vernacular novels, and my PhD was based on Jinping Mei, which I'm sure many of your other people listening today will have at least heard of, if not read themselves as well. Possibly one of the most infamous pornographic, I suppose, long novels of the Ming Dynasty, which gave me great fun and enjoyment as I was doing my PhD. After that, I really then sort of moved quite swiftly into looking at disability, and so this is where I came to find Tiesheng and do some research on him and some of his other works, not actually my travels in Dingyi, but that's how I found Tiesheng, and he's, I think I described him as the writer who writes disability into modern Chinese fiction. And I think that's a good title for him. Whereas I think a lot of his renown before that was he was known as a disabled writer. But I think it's more nuanced and a little bit more accurate to describe it as somebody who writes disability into it. He was disabled, but not necessarily. That's not his entirety for sure. And I think my travels in Dingyi will tell us that as well.
Totally, yes. The Sarah, Chloe, the other guest who we would have had on, her sort of specialism in Chinese studies is looking at spirituality and religion, and that is sort of in this book as well. But just like the aspects regarding the body, it's not the whole thing, it's just one sort of other thematic branch. So what I'm meandering towards is the fact that I don't know much about this, but I do know that Tiesheng was a Christian, and you do see that show up in his writings, but we probably won't be able to delve mega deep into that because our expert is on the ropes right now and recovering. So I guess I said I would introduce myself, so I will. I'm Angus Stewart. I'm here because I'm the host of a podcast called the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast. Essentially, it's all about Chinese fiction in translation. My reading in Chinese is not good enough to be reading the books in the original language, so reading it in English is sort of my speciality. If you'd like to listen to my show, I'm sticking the link in the comments box right now, trchfic.com. So that's me really. There's not a great deal else to say. I have a bunch of questions for you, Sarah, and I'll ask you the first one just now if you're feeling ready.
I'm ready.
It's this. It's sort of a personal one. How did you first become interested in Chinese lit, or indeed anything Chinese?
Oh, anything. I mean, it depends how far you want to go back. But my first degree was in Chinese studies at the University of Durham, and I think, obviously, with a Chinese studies focus, Chinese language was my first love, and very quickly the program took us on to Chinese literature. And I think my first love, really, in terms of Chinese literature, were Mingqing novels, vernacular novels, and I loved the way in which we got a mix, these sort of lengthy novels, often around 100 chapters, and there was a mixture of the vernacular, so the everyday Chinese language mixed up with the classical Chinese, and I think these really sort of captured my imagination. We read things like The Water Margin, Hong Lo Meng, Dream of the Red Chamber. Through this, I also found Jinping Mei, and that led obviously to a career in academia and reading and writing about Chinese literature and society. So that's really how I got into China and Chinese studies and Chinese literature. And I suppose I could, even when I transitioned to look at disability, and my recent book on disability in contemporary China really does have Chinese literature at its heart as well. There are several chapters devoted to Chinese literature and culture and the ways in which representation of disabled bodies and disabled people and discourses of disability are interwoven through literature and into society and back again. So it's I find that literature is always at the core of everything that I've done, and hopefully will continue to do. So it's great that I was able to come back to Tiesheng and delve a little bit more deeply into that today.
Excellent. Yeah, that's precisely what we're here to do. So you've described what sort of led you to Chinese literature. Can you remember your first point of contact with either the sort of literary persona of Tiesheng or just your first contact with his writings?
Oh gosh, it's probably around over 10 years ago now. I can't quite remember. But my first encounter with him was through his sort of semi-autobiographical story, Fate, in which the Chinese is Mingyun. It's the story of his acquiring his disability, his impairment, and I think, if you want to get to know Tiesheng, I think that's really one of the places to start. It's a short story. It's, say, semi-autobiographical, and he really explores this. You used the word grief earlier, and I thought that was quite interesting. And his grief comes from his loss of able-bodiedness and his yearning to be, I suppose, and I'm using inverted commas here, normal once again. And I think that grief of the loss of able-bodiedness is a typical feeling among people with acquired impairments. It's very different, I think, the stories that we get from people who have always lived with disability and impairment, because there's nothing to grieve, because this is how they were born, and this is their whole life experience, and their disabled experience, their disabled identity is almost is born with them. Whereas for Tiesheng, because he came to disability later in life, the way he sort of tries to navigate the loss of his former identity as a non-disabled person, an able-bodied person, and coming to terms with what would be a very different life, sort of really struck me through this short story. And so through that, I then sort of tried to track around through his other works and sort of trace other aspects of his discussions on disability and impairment, but also more broadly the body. And what I found was that Tiesheng has, and as I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, he inserts himself in various ways into his writing. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes he is the narrator, sometimes he explicitly says he's the narrator, sometimes he disguises himself behind multiple layers of characters and narrators. And so you're always on a journey trying to figure out, is this Tiesheng? Is it somebody else? Where does he lie in all of these works? And so, but I think his acquired disability, I think, really then sets up a lot of his work in terms of its exploration of the body, the boundaries of the body, and ultimately, you know, what the value of a human life, and how people find value, how value is ascribed to human life by others in society. And it's sort of you find a lot of these sort of discussions going on between either Tiesheng himself explicitly or his characters. You know, where is the value in life? Does it mean to be human? Can you still be fully human in a disabled body? Even if the body is not disabled, again, what makes a human life valuable? And that's, so I managed to sort of, when I started reading more and more of him beyond this obvious short story, I could see that this permeated pretty much all of his writing, and whether it be short stories, whether it's his jottings, his notes, he does a lot of this short story writing. In Chinese we call them biji, so jottings or short writings, which can be which range across whole sort of areas of thought and philosophy and experience, poetry, and you can see this threaded all through those. So yeah, so Tiesheng essentially became sort of a very important writer for me.
Right. Now, I think I have a clever way here to sort of combine two questions, because you talked about how he sort of is playful or ambiguous or multi-leveled in how he inserts himself in his books, sometimes as a narrator. And I think that is a pretty good way of getting across maybe the main premise of My Travels in Dingyi, because we've got one entity and one lad are our main characters. the entity is some kind of immortal spirit called Shi, and then our, I guess, protagonist is a lad called Ding Yi, who's sort of boyhood and then his youth as a young adult we follow. And then somewhere in the mix is some other guy called Shi Tiesheng, who is different, question mark, from the spirit Shi. And there is a plot, but I feel like the main pitch of the book is sort of that. It's Shi and young Ding Yi going through the world together. But as a student, or as a scholar, sorry, of his works, like, what would you make of that, and how would you compare that to other things Shi Tiesheng wrote?
I think this is really quite typical of his writing. The ways in which he inserts himself into characters, and you are scrabbling to find out, is this his voice? Are we supposed to interpret this as who he is? I mean, the novel, I think, can be seen as, I mean, it takes you from, I mean, the spirit starts I'm gendering it, gendering the spirit there, but I really shouldn't. Starts their life as, we go back to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and it's almost as if the spirit is traveling through humanity, person after person, and then we end up at some point in Ding Yi. And so I think there is this affinity between that, somehow that the spirit and Ding Yi are obviously connected, but they often also feel apart as well. I think there feels like they are two very different characters, even though we're supposed to understand that this spirit is Ding Yi's soul, but the voices that are coming out, I say, very, very, very different. And we follow Ding Yi through, but what we also get is these interspersed, either in the sections, this person, Shi Tiesheng, who we are led to understand, there is discussion about whether he was in the timeline of whether Shi Tiesheng comes after Ding Yi, or whether they're actually sort of simultaneous. There's a lot of talk about time and time as a dimension, and time as, are they overlapping? And even by the end of the novel, we're not quite sure where the sort of the continuity sort of, is it a continuous timeline? I don't think so, because we know Shi Tiesheng in his life and Ding Yi's experiences in the Cultural Revolution would have overlapped anyway. So that sort of is bringing in that temporal overlap between the two. But as going back to the Shi Tiesheng inserting himself into the narrative in these discrete sort of chapters or sections, and it says, Shi Tiesheng interjects and jumps in with lots of ideas. But also Shi Tiesheng's voice is also interjected throughout the dialogues with Ding Yi, between Ding Yi and the spirit. And so we can't simply say that he's separate to all of this. He's inside all of the discussions and threading himself way through. Now, whether this is Shi Tiesheng himself, it's anybody's guess, isn't it? So, but I think the way that all of these voices and these characters are interwoven is very clever. It gets takes a bit of getting used to, I think, as you read it, because you sort of you think, oh, who's coming, whose voice is coming at me? But it's really typical of Shi Tiesheng's writing, I think, particularly this very short chapter sort of way of writing. So we get with titles as well, and that's very sort of similar to his BG type writing. You have an idea, it's developed, and then we move on to something else, which may or may not be related. So it's sort of what also sort of was very interesting to me, or it feels a lot like, I suppose, a painting, a sort of an abstract painting, and you're supposed to put all of these ideas together. They're sort of scattered throughout the novel, and then you put them all together in your head. And
yeah, I know what you mean. It was sort of I felt some of the most coherent ideas about things we face in our own lives, you know, unlike reincarnation, was love. There's a lot of musing on love, and I guess also the soul, and what do love and the soul have to do with each other. So for example, if you fall in love with someone, what part have you fallen in love with? Is it their gender? Is it their body? Is it their personality? Or is it something deeper and harder to grasp than all that? Is it their soul? And I felt like I couldn't really summarize what exactly his point was, apart from maybe the importance of the link between soul and love, because the argument, well, the arguments, they're not arguments, the thoughts that the spirit espouses or bickers with Ding Yi about have a sort of a cumulative effect. I mean, it's a novel. A novel does not exist to put forward an argument or preach, but it can have a sort of a cumulative effect that lets you look at things in an interesting light. And this was, yeah, that was probably one of the things that struck me as being so different about the book. That and the fact, yeah, it was so experimental. I would say weird, but weird sounds a bit pejorative, but really something, at least for me, who's never read anything by Tiesheng before, really quite unique, idiosyncratic. I felt like I was definitely inside the man's head. Maybe partly because three of the characters, we could argue about Ding Yi, but all of those three characters seem to be him in some way, and the characters that aren't him, they're there and they're important, but it doesn't really feel like it's about them.
No,
could maybe,
I think that's right, and
yeah,
it just does feel. And what I felt also is this spirit, in particular, can talk a lot. We sort of get bombarded by thought after idea after idea, and it's almost as if, you know, everything that's inside Tiesheng's head is just falling out on the page in some way, and there may be a rhyme and reason to the order of all these thoughts coming out, but you notice that also that he repeats themes a lot throughout the book, and he'll come back to it. Sometimes he uses the same words, and then sometimes he will use different words, and it's not often, it's actually also not the first time he's said all of this too. So you know, anybody who's read the book will notice that there's a high degree of metatextuality in the fact that there's a lot of reference to other works, insertion of other works.
oh yeah,
We've got the Bible that's in there anyway, we've got sort of quotations from Genesis, and we've got but there's an awful lot also of his own work that he directly cites, which is nice for the modern reader, because I think, you know, this technique of inserting other works into literature is an age-old tradition in China, and scholars wouldn't have had this lovely this idea of telling you actually where it comes from. You know, as a scholar, you should have been up on your reading, you should know where all of these things come from, you should have been familiar with them. So if you go back and you read a lot of the pre-modern literatures, there's a lot of referencing of other works within it, either in the form of poetry or lines or quotations. I mean, very nicely he has identified a lot of the quoted works from that, but actually there's an awful lot of quoted work that isn't actually referenced either, and a lot of it was almost verbatim as well. So quotes from his other works, for example, the notes on principles. He also quotes from Longing for the Temple of the Earth, Rock and Writing, for example, and also I think those are the ones that most obviously sort of cited throughout. But he also takes verbatim a lot of things from Matters of the Soul, which is one of his big works. It would explores love and the soul, and, you know, a lot of the Christian elements of his and sort of more metaphysical exploration. So they're there, and yeah, it's it's a complex work.
for sure. It's so funny that across all of time and across all the globe, intellectuals are basically the same. They just love to show off how much other stuff they've read. And I say this with all self-awareness.
Well, it is, but you know, it's not. I think it's a tradition. It's a Chinese tradition of writing,
Totally,
and it's
totally.
it's. I'm not sure whether he's showing off or not. I mean, what I did find interesting was the ways in which, I mean, this was written in 2006, I think, wasn't it? It was one of his later. I think I can't remember when it was written, but it's one of his later
about
works.
right, I think.
And he's throwing in all of these references to modern, contemporary non-Chinese culture too, which adds again another dimension to the work. I mean, are we reading this as a piece of global literature? Is this peculiarly Chinese with these global literatures and references thrown in? I'm not quite sure. I mean, he throws around names of writers and ideas, and one of the most talked about the book is the ways in which one of his whole chapters is devoted to sex, lies, and videotapes, which is Stephen which is a completely unexpected. But yeah.
Yeah, a summary of the film. If you've never seen it, it's I hadn't seen the film, so I was quite gripped by his summary. But like, if I had seen the film, I might have been skim reading that section. But I sort of I had seen Goodreads reviews that mentioned that chapter before, and in the reviews they felt the reviewers felt a bit sort of surprised and perturbed by that chapter. What they didn't mention is that in various ways after that chapter in the novel, and possibly before as well, the ideas in Sex, Lies, and Videotape about relationships, psychology, sexual relationships, men and women, they absolutely do come up and feed into the sort of playground of thoughts on complex human affairs that are in the novel. So it's not like this silly little thing he threw in to boost the word count. It's totally relevant. It's a bit unorthodox, but as a reader, some readers might love it, some readers might roll their eyes, but I never seen that before, and I honestly quite liked it.
Yeah, I did as well, actually. I mean, it's just one of those films that you watched a long time ago, but I really like the way in which he did then use it as a real tool throughout the remaining chapters to sort of get the characters talking about what it meant to be in love and what sex meant, and whether monogamy was something that what did that mean, what did it mean to be unfaithful? All of these things really then were picked up by it, and I thought that was very cleverly done, and it was really unexpected though.
I can tell you a little bit, a little oversharing a bit from my own life about this film. So I never watched it, but my mum had, perfectly enough, a videotaped copy of it labeled. So a taped off the television video labeled Sex, Lives, and Videotape. And I was like, what is that? Is it something to do with my parents' divorce? And then finally it was gone from the cupboard one day, perhaps for the best. But you mentioned how the book, through its plot and the characters, so maybe we should talk a bit more about, deals with monogamy and things alternative to monogamy, polyamory. So the book's from the People's Republic of China. It's published 2006, but it's a pretty sincere exploration at one point of I think a three-way relationship, and it's not and it's not one-sided. I don't know how I would describe it. You have all the joys and all the sort of unfortunate catches of that sort of dynamic between multiple people. So I won't ask you to go into the mechanics of that, but do you think that makes the book ahead of its time, or just special? Because I've never seen anything like that, not in the Chinese lit I've read anyway.
I think in the way it not only deals with polyamory between humans. I mean, the way that I was sort of reading that also is that we have lots of characters that are also involved in the love story that that's why I said sort of even more, because we have the spirit, sort of formerly Adam looking for Eve, and then we have Dingy, and then we have Dingy's love as well. And so we have this, so these really, and often so Dingyi is looking for a partner, but the spirit is using Dingyi to look for Eve. And so we have, so it isn't just, it transcends just the physical human forms as well, this form of sort of polyamory and sort of loves, multiple loves, thing, and lusts, multiple lusts as well. But you know, going back, I think probably this is probably where my Jingping Mei comes in. I think there's an awful lot of love between multiple partners goes on in Jingping Mei as well. So you know, in the core heart of you know, Jingping Mei is people. I say love, it's probably more lust in Jingping Mei, but you know,
making good use of their bodies.
That's a nice way of putting it, yeah. But you know, Dream of the Red Chamber as well, at its heart there is this sort of this three-way sort of love triangle thing. So it's not, I don't think it's talking about people being in love with multiple others isn't new in Chinese literature, and certainly talking about sex in Chinese literature certainly isn't new either. Right. I think probably what I thought was quite interesting about this is that this was polyamory in its sense that this is a relationship between multiple partners, and it's a consenting relationship between them, and the fact that all partners are sort of, you know, are understanding that they're in a relationship and it's open, and yeah, which I think feels quite fresh. I'm sure maybe people here today will tell me that no, it's happened lots of other times, but I personally can't think of another time that this has been so openly discussed in this way. And I think, but you say, you know, you talk about the fact that it talks about things, sexual behavior and its crudity, there's some crudeness in the language and things. And yes, there is. I mean, it talks about BDSM and it talks about other things, but actually the really crucial thing is when we come to the part where the three principal characters, Ding Yi, Qin and Lu Sat, they come together in this nighttime play. Should we call night play? I think he calls it. Yeah,
it's all a bit intellectualized. It's another intellectual exercise.
It is, but he very clearly says, look, I'm not going to tell you what happened, and I'm going to just leave it to your imagination, because basically everybody imagines what sex is differently, and if you use your imagination, then you can really understand, you can go wherever you want to go with it. But if I tell you it, then it becomes physical and it becomes lewd. So, you know, go ahead. All I'm going to tell you is wildly imaginative, he says. So that's the narrator says. So you're left to your own imagination. So he doesn't go into the nitty gritty of the sexual activity, and yeah, the reader can read into it what they feel like, and so that to me was quite, again, that was a surprise, because you're sort of set up to expect something quite detailed, and then sort of like this, right, go away and think about it, and so you are then forced as the reader to sit there and think about, oh, what are they doing? And all sorts of imaginations do fill your head, and which is very clever, actually, isn't it? I think.
For sure, yeah. So you mentioned, yeah, speaking of other perspectives, I thought at this roughly halfway point we could bring another spiritual entity into the theater. Haiwang Yuan is here, a good friend of Sinoist Books, and a guy who was I believe the translation consultant for this text in translation. So Haiwang, you know a thing or two about my travels in Dingyi. I'm just wondering.
Me too.
I'll just throw a nice juicy question right at you. Haiwang, what do you find most interesting about my travels in Dingyi?
I think the most interesting thing I found in Dingyi, I think is, what interests me is how religious the author is, and he uses this Genesis story to create Dingyi, and Adam and Eve spread came out of the garden, and then try to find a host in anybody they can come to, even a fish or a bird. And then Adam happens to be hosted by Dingyi, even from the time he was born as a baby and until his death. So what interests me is, as Professor Dauncey said, the coming out and in the person. Sometimes he speaks for him, sometimes he speaks, in an attached way, in a dialogue with him. Maybe that's his internal, his thinking, his struggling between himself. I'm not sure, but yeah, that interests me very much. And also I think he shares the desire with the host, Dingyi, to find a person, Eve, which is the hostess. Also, I'm genderizing the hostess of Eve, maybe in or somebody else. I'm not sure who that is. I forgot. That's a long time ago. When I read the book, I think yeah, that interests me. What is also interests me is the relationship between the I, which is the soul of Dingyi or Adam, whatever. And he also sometimes found in Shi, which is Shi Tiesheng, the author. So it's kind of, that's why Ms. Wang found me and asked me to read through the book and see if the author got all the relationships right, which I think he was great. He got it right. He was great. And just a little few places where the dialogue and the literary rendition, the prose and the dialogue sometimes. But I think another thing that interests me is the entangled relationships between that's a way, maybe a kind of a deviating from your question. The relations between the different people, and I think what Dingyi is searching. It's searching for relationships between him and several other women, and he thinks that's great, but he was warned against it and saying that if you turn it into reality, and there would be disaster, that would be dangerous. So that's why the story of this island came in later. So.
Oh yeah, yes, I'd almost forgotten about that. I noticed that. So we have for people who've not read the book, or for people like me who only just remembered until now, we sort of hear secondhand a story happening somewhere in the world of the novel where an author, a poet, has retreated to an island with two women, and then we learn that it ends in tragedy. The poet has murdered them both, and it's. I think on the surface I think the first interpretation is that maybe there was a beautiful idea about a relationship, but the idea didn't bear out in reality. But it reminded me of a real world sort of idealistic author whose name escapes me. But there was a Gucheng, yes, Gucheng, a real poet from, I guess, roughly Shi Tiesheng's generation, maybe a bit younger, I'm not sure.
I think Shi Tiesheng based some of the characters on his story, on the true story. I'm sorry, go ahead. I jumped the gun. Sorry.
Oh, I wasn't going to say anything. Sarah, did you have a thought about that?
No, sorry, I think somebody else was coming in. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I think that was someone else on the mic there.
No, someone
Yeah,
else.
that's
So
right.
I'm enjoying listening to you, Hai Wang. Please carry on.
Okay. Yeah, I think that story, Gu Cheng, that's in chapter 131. It's called the Legend of Danqing Island. So there is a passage reading, and read it, a nameless ocean island, which, by the way, my background is that island in New Zealand, Waiheke. And it's called Danqing Island because some years ago, the poet Dao means also, which with the character that means island, and two of the women he loved, the painter Dan and the painter Qing, actually Danqing means painting, and went there to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. According to them, they were a lost group hoping to find themselves on that desert island. So this episode of three of them, as the author calls, three of them, the relationships, three of them. And it's based on this true story of a poet named Gu Cheng, as I said, and two female painters, his wife, Xie Hua, and his mistress, Li Ying. So they also, tired of city life, Gu Cheng decided to go to that island in New Zealand, which is called Waiheke, as my background shows. And in 1988, the same year I came to the United States. And I'm glad that I didn't go there. The same year I came to the States. 2 years later, Li Ying joined them and tipped the already delicate balance in the relations between the husband and wife. And Gu Cheng fell in love with her. And so his wife tried to finally persuaded him to go to Germany and to leave her on the island. But during that absence, she married a British man and came to and left the island, which is a heavy blow to Gu Cheng. When he came back, he saw she was gone. She was searching him in Beijing, everywhere. Eventually, came back with the wife and axed his wife to death and hanged himself on a tree and killed himself too. So that's the story. So I think Tiesheng thinks that what was in Ding Yi's mind, the multi-relationship between men and women, it should only stay in the ideal, in the drama, in the drama he's writing, as an ideal, as a dream. If it turns into reality like this one, it would be dangerous. The word dangerous, and the tragedy. It would be tragedy. Thank you.
Yeah,
That's
and
my
I
thought.
think it's valuable to talk about things like that in reading clubs like this, because the book, that's one of the references to reality the book doesn't spell out for you. It doesn't say, by the way, this is about Gu Cheng. So if you haven't heard of him before, it's just it's an interesting story.
He was a great poet, yeah, by the way.
Yeah, we're getting into our final sort of 15 minutes, I believe. So I thought I would ask one of my fun later questions, and I'll pass it to Sarah first, since we've not heard from you for a wee while, Sarah. It's this is quite a unusual book, perhaps for some a challenging book. So what kind of reader of literature would you recommend this book to, Sarah?
Oh, interesting question. I think somebody who really likes to challenge themselves in terms of their reader, who isn't afraid to, I suppose, just immerse themselves in the novel. And you know, when I first read this, it was its Chinese version, and so I think probably set myself a challenge. But I was really trying to understand Tiesheng as a writer, as well as the things he wrote about. And I think this is what it does. If you really want to know Tiesheng as a writer, and possibly also Tiesheng as a person, then I think this is the sort of book that you would get. You know, you would get a really good sense of it from that. I mean, what I really loved also, I'm just going back, you asked Hai Wang what he really enjoyed about the book, and I think for me, I really enjoyed the discussions about I would say about the body. I mean, obviously that's what I'm interested in, but also about what the fact that, you know, that he talks often about the body as a prison, the ways in which clothing also plays a role in the presentation or the hiding of the true soul, and this talking about boundaries. So people who are really interested in thinking in different ways about the flesh, the body, the soul, and how all of those things interact, and, you know, where are the boundaries on all of these things. And this, there was naked clothing, and all of those ideas were brought out really quite nicely through the book. And I like the way in which he also, there's a lot of talk about for it to be true love, and I think the spirits themselves is a very is representation of a very pure form of love, whereas Ding-yi is a little bit more lustful, and they gradually merge together over time. But he's the ways in which the love and human forms and flesh sort of come together and move apart. You know, people who are really sort of interested in that, I think that would be really of interest. I mean, the other thing that I think we haven't really talked about, we've talked about, you know, polyamory and things, is there is mention of homosexuality in there. And I thought that was really very interesting the way it was done, and it reminded me, because I think he talks elsewhere about homosexuality, and in the story actually nobody ends up being gay, but there is a suspicion that one of the main characters, Chin Han, is, and it turns out that he isn't. But he's just more open in terms of love, and it reminds me very much of something that he writes in another of his works, and he talks about, and I think this is one of the things where he uses exactly the same words as well in some instances. He just talks about saying that he's not gay. Tiesheng, you know, he says, I'm not gay myself, but he says we've got to think about love. Why is love between, what is love and what is sex? And he makes a really interesting distinction that, you know, the sex is the physical. We have the physical merging of two bodies. It's about flesh. But love, you know, and does gender matter then? You know, you don't need a specific gender to have sex. You know, any gender can have sex. You know, it's about, so love is more than that sexual meeting. So for readers who are sort of interested in discussions about the difference between love and sex, also I think we'll find something really quite interesting in this book.
And like you said earlier, maybe we shouldn't rush to gender our souls. Obviously, in our daily lives, pretty much all of us have some kind of gender identity we identify with. But like at the very, very, very deep level, whether you are a Christian who believes in the soul, or whether you're a hardcore materialist like me, that doesn't get rid of the question of what is deep down inside you. There's something sort of mysterious about it. And maybe you're a person, maybe you're a spirit, to just use a word, maybe you're something, a being, long before you're a man or a woman or straight or whatever. And I would imagine that's something Tiesheng not only felt but thought about. And the book is both of those things. There's a lot of thinking about stuff, but there's a lot of insistence on the importance of feeling things as well. I just wanted to say, continuing that, since our theologist Chloe isn't here, I'll just throw in one of the things I would say is really interesting. If you, regardless of your religion, if you find the literary use of religion to explore interesting angles or ideas, this book has it, because we talked about Genesis and the whole idea of Adam and Eve, some deep yearning between the soul of a primordial man for a primordial woman. But then I believe we have other references to other biblical texts, and all the really deep ones, the book of Job. So if you don't know your Bible, Job is the character who is constantly sort of ruined by life, by the universe, by God, again and again and again. And he's the guy that asks God, why have you done this to me? And God tells him, what is that amazing line? where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth or something? So yeah, there's just really interesting explorations of these really deep parts of like the Bible. And I'm no Christian. I don't really believe these things are real per se, but regardless of what I believe, they're really interesting to explore in fiction. And in a way, it's sort of a little bit, I wouldn't say it's doubly interesting, but there's that little bit of interesting angle where this is not someone from a Christian country exploring the idea. This is an author from China who had his youth in the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah,
That's
I
just
think
interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that's again, I'm wondering if somebody with a Christian sort of background, what they would actually find here, because and I must credit Chloe for this, because I think she's very clear that his background is not his views on Christianity in the way that are real through these works are not orthodox. So maybe he's obviously influenced by Christianity in many ways, and a part of these conversations are him coming, sort of trying to work his way through all of these knotty problems that have kept theologists and philosophers in knots for many years. But so it'd be interesting to, I don't know whether they'd agree with the things that he was saying, but hopefully it would give them some food for thought. But I think fundamentally, I think he's interested in what makes us human. And the book, I think, is really a conversation about where is the humanness in us? Where is our humanity? And I think that's why it's very clever that it's written, well, not very clever. I think it was a common thing for books that were centering on the Cultural Revolution, and books that were sort of coming out by the Tiesheng writers, and the people with the root seeking, that are thinking about where is our humanity, who are we after this turmoil of the Cultural Revolution? What can I pin myself on if I'm to be worth anything? And so using the Cultural Revolution as a very slight backdrop to some of the novel is very interesting, because it's sort of say, who are we as people? Where's my identity? Which is quite interesting too. But he talks a lot also in the novel about the value of things and human vanity too. And I suppose this is where, it's coming to the end of the our conversation. It's quite nice to sort of come back a little bit to why, as somebody who's writing disability into modern Chinese fiction, like as a disabled writer, why the body then becomes so important in all of these things. He's struggling with his own bodiliness, but he's also thinking, so then he's having to think about his spirituality as well, and then they're coming together. And I think he thinks, the way in which the translation talks about it's translated, I think a human body is translated as a human tool, and I'd be quite interested to hear from Hai Wang about why the tool bit was chosen. I mean, it feels that, for me, I felt it was a sort of more poetic translation, might have been vessel because of the chi part of the character. A human vessel for the soul would have been thing. But so the tool feels as if the spirit is going to be using Ding Yi for some purpose. Well, I suppose he does. He tries to find Eve, but yeah. So this bodiliness, this how can somebody have value if their body isn't perfect? And I suppose his conversation then extends to the soul as well. So.
Yeah, Hai Wang, we're getting near the end here, but do you want to respond to that one with a home run?
Which one?
Well, any thoughts on the body, or specifically that translation, the decision to use human tool and not something like vessel?
Actually, Alex translated the book, and as a consultant at that time, I was charged to just find out if all the relationships are messed up. And so this is souls here and there, if they are going to the right place, which I did. And then later I found out that the dialects, like the Beijing dialect sometimes could be misunderstood, mistaken, the face value and the real true meaning and stuff. So at that time, I was not involved in. I didn't think too much of the content of the book, but I was just amazed how religious the author was. And at that time, in the 80s, it was just the Cultural Revolution was just over for a decade or so. And I think this is I think his book might be a reaction to the Cultural Revolutions, a void of thinking, void of religion, void of everything. And and as the body and soul, I think Tiesheng is struggling here. And as a soul, you want to love everybody, but as a body, you have to, abide by the norm of the society. So there's law in there, there's ethics in there, moral. So I think it's struggling. And the book actually asks more questions than solving it, right? It leaves to the readers to think about it. So that's where the significance lies in the book. So when you read the book, you think about it. You think about life, body, soul, and stuff. Thank you.
I agree so much with what you said there. Today is the last day of my 20s. I turned 30 tomorrow, and I got to say about my 20s, my 20s was the time when I really faced up to the fact my body wants things, my soul wants things. I have a body, I have a mind. I can do things to sate those desires, chase after those needs. But of course, the lesson many of us learn in our 20s, or maybe younger or older, is if you chase those things too hard, you'll fall off a cliff, you'll crash into a wall, and you might hurt people. So yeah, those thoughts are totally explored in the book. I think, I know we're not trying to gender too much, but the trials and tribulations of being a young man who thinks about things too hard, tries to get things a bit too hard, hasn't learned to chill out quite yet. If that stuff interests you, and I suppose that's not just a male thing, is it? It's just gendered male in Dingyi. If you're filled with longings that you either figured out or are still trying to figure out, it's a perfect novel for you. We have a question from the floor. So, and we've been going for an hour, but in the spirit of freedom and exploration, we can go slightly over the hour and get some questions from the floor. So we even have an answer from the floor as well. So Christine asked, at the risk of being too meta, and go for it, be meta, do any of the experts think there is a spiritual successor to Shi Tiesheng's work in Chinese literature today? Do you think anyone is carrying on with the baton? And Chloe Starr, our spiritually present expert, answered in the chat, Beizun and Shulwei are writing good spirit lit now. Oh, thank you, Shinran. Shinran has said, enjoy your 30s. That's my plan, but I'm going to enjoy them a bit more sensibly in my 20s. So experts, is there a new reincarnated Shi Tiesheng in the world?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, it depends. I mean, obviously Chloe's response there about Beizun and Shulwei, spirit literature. I mean, that's her remit rather than mine. I think there are a lot of authors who have carried on this idea sort of humanity and feeling that the need to bring what it means to be human into literature and to sort of turn away. I think possibly but in a different way, because I suppose Shi Tiesheng was writing at a time when coming out of the Cultural Revolution, there was this new turn to humanism, and that trying to sort of think about what it meant beyond being, what is a deeper truth beyond sort of Marxism and all of these other sort of more materialistic concerns. But that materialism is a very different thing now, isn't it, in contemporary China? And I think there are a lot of writers responding to that humanism in a slightly different way, but also the way he writes as well, I think probably inspired. I'm struggling to think of very specific people here, but I think this sort of more episodic way of writing, I think, has inspired many people in the ways in which they're writing. That writing doesn't necessarily have to be linear. That actually we can have streams of consciousness, and that this idea of a narrator, you know, who is that idea of a narrator? I think that's been taken up by many different people, but I don't know the writings of Beethoven and Shuwei, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that.
I have my own comment. I've been trying to find the exact lyrics. I can't quite remember them, but there's an amazing album by American hip hop group The Roots called Undone, UNDUN. It's about a guy who lived a sort of, came up hard, fought hard to enjoy his life, lived quite selfishly, tried to find some meaning in his life, too late, died. And the album is written from his perspective, looking back on his life, which just feels really appropriate for my travels in Dingyi, kind of a colder version of it. But there's a line, I can't quite remember the exact wording, I haven't been able to find it, but it's something like, the spirit is in the sky like airwaves. And I think that's it. I don't necessarily think we're reborn into a new body when we die, but we do leave behind our transmissions. So even if there isn't a new Shi Tiesheng, he made his contribution to Chinese lit and maybe even to the world of literature through translation. And that's how he lives on. And we're helping him stay alive in the airwaves, in cyberspace right now. So that, yeah, I just wanted to say that. I see we got more questions from the floor. Excellent. Daniela Lincandro, I hope I didn't pronounce that too badly, said, thank you for the inspiring discussion. I have 2 questions. Number 1, Freudians are rubbing their hands with glee at this one. Do you think that psychoanalysis, besides religion has a place in Shi Tiesheng's literary experiment? And number 2, returning to Professor Dauncey's points on Shi's exploration of questions pertaining to bodily impairment, I have the impression that the issues related to the body seem to acquire a universal dimension applicability. I wonder to what extent they may also speak to historically determined discourses of able-bodiedness in contemporary China. Thank you. Beautifully written, Daniela. 2 quite big questions. Maybe we can start with the psychoanalysis one. If we put Dingyi on the couch, what are we going to find? Anything?
I don't know. Not being an expert in psychoanalysis, I'm not quite sure, but probably. I think that's probably, yeah. I think that's probably a whole thesis in that there.
Yeah.
He's, in terms of, I suppose, sort of some more Freudian sort of analysis. There is a lot of discussion in the book about sort of the very primal aspect of human nature, and I think, you know, we get a lot of the discussion about how animals and humans are sort of separated in various ways, but actually that people can be separated in more ways than humans and animals, and there's a lot of discourse about that. But sort of, you know, sex as a function of animals and beasts, whereas love isn't there. I think is there, and that's something I think would be quite interesting for somebody to follow up. But yeah, what would Dingyi say if he was on the couch? I'm not quite sure. I don't think even Shi Tiesheng would know, actually, to be honest, because you could see that vacillation sort of happening throughout that. But in terms of the second question, obviously it was a little bit closer to what I can probably talk to, and I think, yeah, you know, I've obviously read this as very much as based on Shi Tiesheng working through his own, you know, relationship with his body, and I think that's really important to note. But it does bring, but I suppose the purpose of his writing is also to then extend that to become much more universal. You know, bodies in general. You know, the full. I mean, I think even in the novel, there's actually there's a quote about what is full, full bodiliness or full human. I can't remember what the quote was. I wish I could remember it. It might come to me. But thinking about how the whole discourse of able-bodiedness in China, and you know, it's very much embedded. If we think of the dominant discourses, the norm, the ideal is able-bodiedness, and any form of defect, whether it's bodily or mental defect, I think sort of informs his understanding of where he is as a person, but also really, I think it informs all of our relationships to our bodies as well. I mean, we are all thinking about, we're fearing that point in time, if it hasn't already come, where our bodies begin to decline and decay, and our minds begin to decline and decay as well. And so thinking about how a person then navigates that changing landscape of their experience against a discourse which tells you that if you don't have full able-bodiedness and full sort of mental capacity, then you're something less than the ideal, that you're something less than fully human in Chinese discourse eyes, and sort of the dominant discourse eyes. Yeah, I think it's a thought for us all, should we say. I think, you know, not just people who have acquired an impairment like Tiesheng did in his life. And I think his skill as a writer is sometimes to tell us all of these things without actually mentioning disability or deformity or impairment. He gets us to think about where our bodies can take us and where our minds can take us, and often then that flies in the face of what the state and what you know, sort of tells people is of value. And you know, it's trying to find that way between the messiness of life and the strict parameters of what it means to be a citizen and a person in China today. That's a really interesting question. Thank you.
I'll try and answer the Freudian one in undergraduate level. I don't know if anyone here in this Zoom room ever watched or is a fan of the Japanese anime Neon Genesis Evangelion, but that is Daniel's laughing. That is a really Freudian piece of fiction, which has the word Adam and Eve in it as well, and Lilith as well. But it has all that Christian imagery and things lifted, maybe not explored metaphysically. But I think the fact it's got Adam and Eve in there is a huge sign that we're going into mummy issues and daddy issues and primal stuff. It's a really primal show. I think in Ding Yi, I don't know if mummy and daddy issues are there, but I think we can take the Adam and Eve as a clue that there's something deep that I don't necessarily know what the psychoanalytic reading would be, but there's something there deep in who we are. I don't know. I'm unable to finish that thought, but I think, yeah, if you're looking for all the horrible stuff Freud would have dug up, I think start with Adam and Eve and then work from there. That's my absolutely rubbish analysis. Haiwang, did any of this prompt any thoughts in you?
Well, not offhand, but yeah. You know, humans are always struggling like that, body and the soul, and you know, in Chinese culture, it was predominantly not atheist, but the Chinese have their folk religion, and they also have Taoist, and later they even Sinophonized Buddhism and take into their fold as their own. For instance, when I first came to the United States, my mom was not religious and never went to any temples or anything, but he went to a temple and prayed for my safety. So actually, for Tiesheng to write about this, that's very, very eye-opening, even to the Chinese. he is not representing. He doesn't represent the mainstream of thinking in China, but he's a avant-garde. I think he's avant-garde, and he's eye-opening the Chinese, open a new field for the Chinese to see themselves, to examine themselves in terms of Christianity. That's great. That's great. So I think that's part of the contribution he made to the world.
And you've reminded me how to finish my thought. So I think there is a dad in this story, actually. I think it's the spirit Shi. I don't know if any of you have ever imagined what you would do if you could go back and advise your young self how to live their life correctly. But I feel like he's often trying to give sort of wise advice to Ding. He calls him that Ding quite a lot, at least in the English translation. So sometimes he's encouraging him, other times he's scolding him, but he's sort of there as a dad figure. And if you want to get Freudian about it, I suppose the part of the Freudian system that's sort of the level of our mind that tells us no, don't do that, that would be the superego. The part of us that, as far as my terrible understanding goes, cheers you on, that's your ego. And then the deep, dark, animalistic side is the id. I don't really know where Shi would fall. He'd probably be a little bit of ego, a little bit of superego. But go on.
That might also be rooted in the Chinese Confucianism, like examine yourself and contain yourself, cultivate yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. He's whether it's discipline or it's encouragement, he's sort of like a teacher figure, which again, from the one Confucian book I've read, I can see the comparisons, but I'm not saying these things are there in the book. These are probably in our analysis. It's a book that's meant to make you think, and if you're with other people, maybe you could talk about it.
Yeah, I think just to come back on that, I think that you're saying that the spirit actually is a teacher of some sort, but I found actually that the spirit learned just as much from Ding Yi and his experiences as he probably told Ding Yi, probably more. So he leaves that open, doesn't he? And I think that's because I think, and so many times is, he's really surprised me. He actually knows some stuff, that Ding Yi. So he's not sort of suggesting, I think, that the spirit is an all-knowing being that sort of is here to tell us, unimportant humans, what we should do. I think that the learnings of eternity are in the spirit, but it's a spirit that keeps on learning as it goes as well, and isn't always open to new ideas.
And that's something we can all aspire to in these book reading clubs. Always keep cultivating, always keep learning.
That's also kind of reflects the Chinese philosophical dialectical idea of a whole, but the whole. The yin and yang. It could be the yin and yang, two things in yourself. You struggle with yourself. Sometimes you tell yourself to do this. Sometimes there's something in you and say, hey, no, right? So I see more struggle in one person. Yeah.
There will be, on my 30th birthday party on Saturday, there will be a yin and a yang. One will be saying down the pints, and one will be saying take a break, have some water, have a cola. But yeah, I had a lovely elegant note to end on, but instead we'll end on that. I'm gonna say a big thank you to Sarah. Thank you for coming along and sharing your learned thoughts. Thank you, Hawang, for jumping in and joining us, and thanks, Chloe, for being here in spirit, just as one should be for a book of the spirit. I'll pass back to Daniel to talk earthly affairs, which I wouldn't deign to soil my soul with.
Well, I'll stay my soul. No worries. Thank you very much for everyone who for coming, and thank you so much to all of the guests, Sarah, Haiwang, Angus, for hosting. I'm pleased to say that we have already the next event currently set up for the 31st of March, I believe, at 5 p.m. GMT. And it is going to be on this book, Cherries on a Pomegranate Tree, which is by a contemporary Chinese male author called Li and translated by Dave Haysom, who will be joined by. And it is perhaps the first ever book in English translation that tells China's controversial one-child policy from the perspective of its enforcers. So to give you a kind of just a 1,000-mile view of the plot, she is the provincial female village head of a very small village, and she has a wide portfolio of different responsibilities. One of which is enforcing the one-child policy, but she also has to deal with, for example, the graves at the edge of the village being haunted, or there is some rich American coming into town that she needs to keep happy for him to invest in the village. And there's also like all the kind of local drama that you get with rural China that piled on top of her, basically. And it's how she deals with this intricate web of like relationships and kind of situations that she finds herself in that where we'll find our plot. It is part of our subscription scheme. So for the subscribers among us, you will be getting this book as soon as we get our hands on it. And I believe it just arrived in Southampton as of 8 hours ago. So we'll be very pleased to send it out once we get our mitts on it. And we look forward to seeing you on the 31st of March. Thank you for that. And I think thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And I hope you have a wonderful evening.